So that's where you may look at Çatalhöyük on a survey map and say, oh, well, that's definitely a primate site. You start digging it and you realize, no, it's actually just a really big village. So even within the context as well, you can see that the placement of certain objects in certain locations tells you something about that. So I've got a slide here that says basalt rubbing stones on plaster floor 50 square 44 T15. This is something I excavated in Syria. And there's a bunch of grinding tools littering the floor of a palace. That tells you what's happening in the palace. And we know it's a palace because it's at the Acropolis there's a big city that it sits on top of. It's walled, and the Acropolis is walled. And in this specialized building, you have accounting. They're actually writing things down. And that tells you that, and there's big storage facilities here too, and processing facilities for grain. And so this was now an agrarian society from about 2500 BC to about 2300 BC, that they were pulling in all the grain into a central location, processing it, sending it back out to the people as payments. So this is a redistributive economy. So contexts tell you that you didn't just grow your own grain, you grew grain for the Acropolis, for the rulers. And that grain went to them, they took their cut through taxes, and then you got a wage as a consequence. So you didn't own your own field, you didn't grow your own crops, you got paid to do this by the state. So contextual analysis within a site then tells you a little bit about their social organization as well. You also get some perplexing things, like that the context tells you a little bit about them. So I have figurines. They look like toys, right? Some are horses or probably onagers. There's dogs and sheep, and there's probably a bull. And this bull has been sealed over with a seal impression of an elite type seal impression. So this shows that they're actually controlling these these model animals. So that's not just a plaything. It's not just a child's toy. It's also found in the same context as things like these basalt rubbing stones, grinding implements, and accounting devices and storage facilities. So they were probably somehow controlling, through the Acropolis, animal husbandry. And were also maybe that was part of their spirituality and religion, and government was also being imbued into this as well, because some of these were found in a cultic context near what was probably meant to be a temple. And we know that it was important. I've got some graphs here that show that administrative residue seals, seal impressions, tablets, that sort of thing, agricultural food processing as well, make up a huge percentage of what you find in the Acropolis. The second most frequent thing was models of animals and other types of things like houses and carts. So if this is an administrative and agricultural processing area, these models are also as important as well. So we don't fully understand what these clay animal models were for, but it's got to be something relating to the activities taking place in the palace, not just a bunch of kids running around with their toy dogs. Also, some special objects tell you, maybe even more explicitly than writing can, about ideology. And I have here, we're going to talk more about this later on, the Uruk vase from Mesopotamia. Unfortunately, it was in the Iraq Museum and got smashed in the Second Gulf War. But it's been restored, thankfully, but it's a real loss. This is a very important stone carved vase, because what it is it's telling the story of social hierarchy. It's telling the story of social organization through pictures. And if you look at it, right at the bottom of that vase, there's these wavy lines. That's waters. That's water, probably Euphrates and Tigris rivers, but also the waters of chaos, the Abzu, as they called them. So at the very foundation of everything is Abzu, the waters of chaos. And from that, you have the land, and the crops start growing. And the crops that are growing on the land, they feed the animals. And those animals, then there's some missing panels on this, but those animals then feed and are cared for by the people that grow the crops and care for the animals. And then those produce products, milk and bread and beer and these sorts of things that you then show a panel of the people who control those things, the elites, start to then bring them to the palace. And you come up and you have you would have the soldiers that protect the palace, and then you have all of these things that are brought to the palace stored, and the scribes are recording them. And so all of the gifts from all the way from the waters of Abzu up to the palace, you have then the storage location, the scribes controlling that, and then you have the banquets and the feasts that the elites attend in the presence of the gods. So you have from the very bottom the waters of Abzu all the way up to the great gods. And everybody has their place. Everything in the cosmos has its place. And so this vase is actually a depiction of the way that people thought emically about the way their social organization was situated. Sometimes you have maybe not quite so explicitly, self-consciously descriptive depictions of social organization like the Uruk vase. I have another slide about that shows Clovis points, maybe some Folsom points in there as well, and then the Hasket projectile points, which are the Western stem tradition local to the Great Basin and right here in Nevada. The Clovis points tend to be a little bit further to the east of here. Now, for a long time, Clovis was thought to be the earliest objects left behind by the earliest inhabitants of North America, human inhabitants of North America. We now know things go a little bit earlier than that, but importantly, these are almost certainly these Clovis points on the left-hand side of that slide were to hunt megafauna, big game, right? They were spear points that were for hunting. And it now appears that the Hasket projectile points overlapped in time, or maybe were completely contemporary with the Clovis points. And the Hasket points are also projectile points for spear tips for hunting big game. So why do you have two types of things sort of overlapping with one another, Nevada and then New Mexico and Arizona? Why do you have the Clovis over to the east and the Western stem tradition over in the west where we are? Well, probably because they had different traditions. They were different groups of people that did things slightly differently, but for the same purpose. They were all hunting big animals, but they had different techniques. And this is style. We talked a little bit about this in terms of stylistic changes in cars, right? Now, we at one point thought that this was a chronological thing, that the Western stem tradition was later. Now we know that it actually was competing versions of this thing. So archaeologists, once we get the chronology sorted out, we then realize, wait a minute, this isn't a change through time, but it's actually the contemporary times, but they're doing things slightly differently. Now, what does that tell us? Well, they may have been different groups of people. They may have seen the people here in Nevada might have seen the Clovis people, the people that used Clovis points as a different group of people. Does that mean they didn't like them? Not necessarily. It just, they didn't have the same production traditions that the people that used Clovis did. So you've got to use all of this evidence that you can find. Things like building big, monumentality tells you something about the social organization. Why do you build big? Why do you build a bigger house than somebody else? How do you see differences in the way individual people might have been viewed in society? Well, sometimes their burials differ. Maybe you have a really big burial with a bunch of stuff laid in there. Let's say you had, in the Bronze Age, you had 100 pots in this one burial and only 2 pots in another burial. Does that mean that that person with 100 pots is more important? Maybe. Or maybe they were actually a potter. Maybe that was their profession, and so they were buried with a bunch of their stuff that they came from. So you have to really kind of take it all apart. Differential access to diet. Some people eat better than others. Some people eat more, or different types of food. That can tell you about ethnicity. It can tell you about wealth. And this can all be analyzed by things like analysis of the bones, but also archaeobotanical and archaeozoological remains tell you about what kind of food was eaten. Some types of sites act as central places. That can be a capital, or it can be maybe something a bit more ephemeral, like a place of congregation or a spiritual center. You also need to look at the economy. How are people what was people's means of production, and how does that reflect in their mode of production? Was there specialization? Were some people doing very specific tasks, like I'm a scribe, and I'm a farmer, and I'm a warrior? Well, that tells you have a certain type of social organization that's hierarchical, ranked, with specializations. That's usually indicative of either complex chiefdoms or states. Whereas in smaller scale communities like hunting bands, you often get everybody does everything, right? You make your own baskets, and you hunt your own meat, and you gather your own food, or you do it collectively. Is there taxation? Can you see that there's actually things coming into a redistributive economy and then coming back out? What kind of language is being spoken? Is that possible to even know? Are there different types of traditions that maybe aren't language but symbolic references? That maybe there's artistic traditions that indicate certain types of ethnicities. And also we can even look into things like genetics, and then to see different groups of people. And all of this, it can be applied to interpretations that you can see from this evidence: division of labor, what the economy was like, trade and exchange, gender and kinship. Was it matriarchal, matrilocal, or was it patrilineal, patrilocal? Is there certain identities or stages of life, or rituals, or spiritual practices? Does writing come in, or is it just oral traditions? And how does ethnoarchaeology help us to define certain classifications of different types of social organizations? One thing to keep in mind, and we talked a little bit about in the last chapter, is that there's a constant feedback loop between top-down approaches and bottom-up approaches. You have individual agents, actors, people in the past, but they're not entirely free to just think anything. They have language, they have syntax, they have a social understanding that is embedded in them from when they are growing up in that society. So you can rebel against a society, but your thoughts are at least in part structured by the society that you grow in. You've got to have something to rebel against. And so we're picking up the objects that are really just a point, a piece in this feedback loop between an object and the mind that perceives it. And it's not our mind that we're interested in. It's the mind of the person in the past that we're interested in. You can sometimes see that the scale of interpretation is important as well. That, are we trying to describe a society in terms of an entire region? Okay, you may use certain descriptions to describe a state-level organization at a regional level. But how does your everyday life, how does a household exist in a state-level society? Is it the same kind of organization at a household level as you get at the region-wide level? Maybe. Maybe not. You often get that in the mind, a person's identification with a certain social structure influences things from the top all the way down. And so you have often self-similarity at multiple scales. That yes, you might very well organize your house the same way you would organize a corporation or a government, right? But and this can be modeled sometimes mathematically. There are some archaeologists who use simulations with certain inputs to try and model social change by setting parameters and seeing how mathematical models work. Things like fluid dynamics is a good inspiration for this. How do clusters of social organization evolve from complex systems? Complex dynamic systems models can be used to help us understand how the very chaotic and seemingly unpredictable human nature can actually produce predictable patterns. So why do we find urban centers across the world, even though they're unrelated to one another? Because humans behave in certain ways that is sort of predictable, even though the microscopic level of that is unpredictable at a moment-to-moment level. So this brings us into science, and we talked a little bit already about processualism, and processualism wanted to understand the processes in the past by breaking it down into manageable parts and bringing science into it to try and scrutinize that at a very microscopic level. And Louis Binford looked at middle range theory, which was this sort of the structure and the agency, and trying to find where that sort of the truth lies in between structure and agency. Nothing wrong with that. And I talked a little bit before about archaeology as sociology, big picture. How good can we get with archaeology as anthropology, the anthropology of an individual person? There's a constant interplay between the big picture and the microscopic level, and middle range theory kind of tries to find that middle space between those two things. Middle range theory looks at the causal relationships between dynamics and statics. That is to say, things like statics are artifacts and ecofacts, the things in the world, and the dynamics are the social things, the things that are sort of fluid and moving through our brains. Patterns in static remains can then reflect upon what's going on in your brain. And this is where inference of past dynamics from the observation of patterns in the archaeological record are made. And this uses systems model and multivariate approaches, not monocausal. So it's not just where is the water? Okay, that's what we're going to inevitably find, where the people, and there will inevitably be a city that grows out of that. That's not necessarily the case. There's multivariate causal factors, and there's systems at work. But post-processualism brought in relativism into this. And in fact, postmodernism is also a critique of this scientism, this approach that we can know everything with precision, and that we can make inferences of the dynamics from static remains. The picture I have here is by René Magritte. Ceci n'est pas une pipe. This is not a pipe. Now, the reason why I put that there is because it's not a pipe, but it is a pipe. I mean, it's a picture of a pipe, right? But the picture says this is not a pipe in French. So what does that mean? Well, it's not a pipe, it's a picture of a pipe. But is it really it's a pipe? I mean, you could look at it and it's a pipe, and I could go back and forth with this over and over again. The point that postmodernism is bringing up is that we can objectively draw a picture of something, but is that really it that we're drawing? Taking a step back and saying, okay, well, yes, it is, because that's my perspective. I look at it, but it's not really a pipe. I can't smoke it. What if someone were to stand behind me and look at me observing this pipe? That's also postmodernism. That you're actually taking steps back from the perspective to try and look at how that perspective changes the way that you look at those things. So postmodernism, the critique of postmodernism is important because it challenges our ability to actually say the truth about the past, which is what post-processualism was really getting at. Relativism, anthropological cultural relativism, tells us that actually there are multiple ways of experiencing social order, right? So my perspective is different from your perspective, even today in our own society. We can call ourselves Las Vegans or Nevadans or Americans, but my experience of all three of those things is different from yours. So which is true? They're all true, right? So this is where social sciences can have an element of subjectivity to them. Although archaeology is trying to get hard scientific data and processualism was trying to make inferences off of those, the ultimate truth is that social sciences have to have a degree of subjectivity to them, and we have to acknowledge that we're bringing our own biases to them. And so we have to ask, are we predetermining categories? Are we answering the questions before we ask them? Because that's the way I think about it. So, okay, where is the mother and the father in the past? Does there have to be a mother and the father in the past? That's just one example. You know, if you go into an archaeological community and you're already asking questions that are coming from your predetermined categories, you may be ignoring the fact that something obvious may be different. And that's where our things like colonialism and post-colonial archaeology is trying to pull us out of that mindset of our own biases. And the philosophical concept of phenomenology is trying to place a person into that emic world from the past as well, with varying degrees of success. So after this debate, though, as I've mentioned in Chapter 2, processualism and post-processualism have largely resolved themselves into a single issue that we're all trying to refine. One of the giants of processualism, Colin Renfrew, his real name is Lord Professor Dr. Colin Renfrew of Kamesthorne, but Colin to his friends. Colin Renfrew